Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize podcast. This podcast is generously sponsored by the Blavatnik Family Foundation. Hello, and welcome to everyone joining us today on Read Smart, the official podcast for the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction. Now, we've just announced this year's brilliant Longlist, which is made up of 12 fascinating works of non-fiction, which have now entered the race for the 2024 prize. Covering themes including displacement, colonialism, and nuclear war, the list collectively sheds new light on the complexities of our contemporary world. I'm pleased to welcome two members of this year's judging panel, Peter Hoskin and Chitra Ramaswamy. Today, they'll be sharing their insights on what makes these 12 outstanding books deserving of a spot on this year's Longlist. Peter and Chitra, welcome. Many thanks for coming on the show.
Hello.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Chitra, let's start with you. What were the challenges of narrowing the submissions down to a long list?
Oh, it has literally been the hardest and also most joyous spell of reading in my entire life. I mean, we started with around 350 books, and we finish with our long list of 12, each of which I'm so proud of, as though I wrote them myself, frankly. It's been such a intricate and very, very sensitive process, actually, because while you're looking for certain criteria, which I'm sure we can go on to talk about, and I'd love to hear what Pete's got to say about this as well, exactly what we were looking for in each text. Ultimately, you also want a long list that kind of is in conversation with one another, the books that kind of sit well together. So you're both looking at each individual title on its own merit and in its own kind of context, politically, historically, culturally, temporally, and you're looking at the long list as this kind of list of 12 books that speak to one another in some way. It's been fascinating.
Pete, how did you find the process?
Well, just a second Chitra, really. I think what really stood out to me was the emotional aspects of it. They say that a book for a writer is like their child, and I feel now I've got at least 60 to 100 children. It's it's tough letting them go. You're really proud of the ones that make it through. For me, normally in my day job as a literary editor, books almost become like a disposable currency. So you get so many, and you read a few, and you put some in the bin, and you give some away, and they're disposable. But these ones, like the Baillie Gifford books that I've read, I've got piles of them at home, and I just cannot let them go. I've written Baillie Gifford Prize 2024 in the front of all of them, and I'm just going to keep them with me because I think they will stay with me for my life. So that's the thing that really stood out to me. It's kind of, as Chitra said, it's been just the most joyous, rewarding, but also difficult form of reading that I've ever had to do.
I can absolutely identify. I judged the prize a couple of years ago, and all of those books just still resonate somewhere within me. I mean, the list holds a mirror up to our modern world, and it does so in a range of ways. And I know, Chitra, you said 350 books were submitted. What trends or preoccupations could you see amongst these? You said it was important for them to be in conversation with each other. So I'm wondering what the thread was that ran through.
Yeah, it's fascinating to sort of use the books that are published within a year as a kind of litmus test for where we're at in society. Because, of course, it takes many, many years, sometimes decades to write books of this caliber and with this level of research. So I find it astonishing to think that these writers were thinking, into the future, almost thinking our future, from years and years ago. To sit in that room with all of those books in front of us, however many months ago that was such a kind of honor, really. And there were definitely some trends that I noticed straight away in that first meeting that we had, and they were themes around ideas of home and belonging and colonialism and imperialism, but also a kind of move away or a disruption of sort of Eurocentric thinking and a more sort of thinking in terms of the global majority, particularly Asia. We saw quite a lot of focus on. There was also some fabulous biographies. And there were a couple of books, both of which have made it onto the long list. I'm thinking here of Melting Point and Question 7 that challenged the very idea of what a nonfiction book might be. I'm talking there about kind of formal or more creative disruptions as well as thematic ones. But yeah, I would say Home. Oh, and The Shadow of the Bomb. That's been a big one.
And we're going to go into each of the books a little bit later on. But right now, Pete, if we could go back to a question that the Chitra raised about the criteria that you held the books up to. What were those for you?
I think all of the books face the same criteria in a way. I think obviously they had to be well written. This is a literary prize as much as it's a sort of non-fiction prize. So these books have that feel of literature. They're artistic, they're poetic. The author is engaged with the prose. They also, I think, have to have a certain depth of research or knowledge behind them. Obviously, that differs per book. So take a massive book on our long list is Revolusi, about Indonesia's independence from centuries of Dutch rule. And that obviously has had years and years and years of study go into it. But a book, I suppose, on the other hand, say Salman Rushdie's Knife, about a very personal experience, which was his knife attack in 2022, I think, where he almost lost his life. Obviously, that doesn't quite have the same level of research, but what you're seeing in that book is again, decades of a life lived, of knowledge. It all bubbles up. And I think we wanted that very tangible quality of knowledge, of research. And then I think there was also an element that was quite hard to grasp in a way, but Chitra's touched on it, which is relevance, I suppose. We didn't go into this thinking these will be the themes that we will identify, or these are the themes that we're looking out for. But the books, nevertheless, these themes emerged, and The Shadow of the Bomb, which is Chitra mentioned, like that was almost the most surprising to me because, okay, we've had the Christopher Nolan movie Oppenheimer, but it's still strange to just see the nuclear bomb come up so much in so many books. It's there in Question 7, Richard Flanagan books. It's obviously there in Judgment at Tokyo, which is about Japan at the end of the Second World War. It's there there's a book, the Annie Jacobsen one called Nuclear War, which has a massive atomic explosion on its cover. It's, there it's clear. But that one almost surprised me. But I think it's nevertheless relevant because the bomb has become part of our lives in recent years. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's something that we've been talking about a lot more. And so I think we were looking for this relevance, and sometimes it surprised us where it came from. But I think all of these books are stunningly relevant.
Now, 3 authors who've been previously recognised at the highest level for their works of fiction. I'm thinking here of Salman Rushdie, Richard Flanagan. They've both won the Booker, and Viet Thanh Nguyen, who won the Pulitzer for fiction. They're now going for the double. I wonder what that means for the literary landscape and the connection between the two genres, between fiction and non-fiction, Chitra.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the most interesting aspects of judging the prize this year, is seeing some of those borders between how we look at genre becoming more porous. And I love that. I think the sort of clearest example of that is Question 7, which employs literary, even I would go so far as to say fictional techniques to tell a very much a true story, and a very complex, very sort of tenderly threaded story. And then, yeah, this sense of having, an author like Rushdie on our long list is just thrilling, frankly. But then if you look at the world in which we're living, is it any surprise, frankly, that we have authors of fiction talking about the oddities, the extremities, and the absurdities, and frankly, the horrors of the real world in which we're living. So, actually, I think that is also a mirror held up to society. I completely agree with everything that Pete was saying about the criteria. And I think the criteria showed us that actually we need to be more open minded and open hearted in our thinking of what nonfiction might be and what it can do in the world in which we're living now.
We've spoken about Rushdie. We've talked about Richard Flanagan, Viet Thanh Nguyen. These are major figures from the literary world. But as well as them, of course, there were some debut authors. And I wonder how the experiences of different authors come into play when you're choosing a long list, Pete.
In a way, I mean, I'm speaking for myself here. In a way, they almost don't come into play. The names you've just mentioned are very grand ones who have won big prizes before, but they're not on the long list because of who they are. I mean, maybe we can parenthetically say Rushdie might be because he had that experience, and his experience has sort of marked in some way the 20th century and the 21st century. So it had to be Rushdie who wrote that book. But I don't know. When I read, say, Rachel Cockrell, her book Melting Point, which is just fantastic, and again plays with these ideas of memoir, fiction, non-fiction, and how non-fiction is constructed. I mean, it's on the long list because it's as good as book as the other books, and she has brought a sort of base of knowledge, of inquiring mind, and brilliant sort of curatorial spirit to that work that I think we just had to recognize. I'm not sure, and Chitra might disagree with me on this. I'm not sure I was thinking, oh, here's a debut author, here's a grand author. I think we were just judging each book on its own merits, which sounds like a cliche, but I think it's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do completely agree with that. And in some ways, I think that is the challenge of judging and trying to leave your biases outside the door or outside the room, or at least be ultra aware of what your biases might be. Because when you pick up a memoir by Salman Rushdie, you are going to look at it differently to picking up a book, say, by Rachel Cockrell, who I'd never heard of before. So I always really go back to the prose and to the book at the level of the sentence and how the author is handling their material. But it can be hard to sort of leave those big personalities out of the equation.
Well, let's go through the books, through the 12 on the long list. And we'll start with Judgment at Tokyo, World War II on Trial, and the Making of Modern Asia. Pete, what for you was it that put that book on your list?
Gosh, I think this is the book for which the word totemic was made. It's a big book, but I think it's also a very important book. This is about, I've already mentioned, Japan at the end of the Second World War, but a specific moment. Basically, you might say it was Japan's equivalent of the Nuremberg trials that German leaders faced after the Second World War. It was its reckoning with what had happened. And I say what had happened rather than its reckoning with the Second World War, because actually this is one of the interesting things that comes out of the book. Japan's inquiry into itself was much more open-ended. There was a big debate before it started that, how far should they go back? Some Japanese figures wanted to go back decades, even centuries, to say where did things start going wrong in a way. And it was so open-ended that in a way there couldn't be a satisfying resolution. And I think this is what Gary Bass in this book captures so well. He's put so much research. It's so dense with information. But he still captures this sense that it kind of almost leads nowhere. It's not the satisfying end that maybe people wanted after the war. But that is a very interesting thing. And I think in this book as well, you see almost something of the birth of modern Japan, a country that's still wrestling with that past because it hasn't had that easy solution at the end of it all. So yeah, I just think as a work of history, it's a mammoth task, and Gary Bass has pulled it off pretty darn well.
Chitra, how about Jonathan Blitz's work? That's called Everyone Who Has Gone Is Here, The United States, Central America, and the Making of a Crisis.
Oh, this is such a fantastic book. And Blitzer is a reporter for the New Yorker. So he has been following what's been happening in terms of the US-Mexico border over recent years. But in this book, he goes further back than that. So he's looking really from the kind of 1970s-ish onwards at how exactly immigration across that border has changed. How, what was once kind of single men crossing the border, how did we get to a situation where it was families, children, women, and then how these families were being separated at the border in the era of Trump. So Trump takes up a certain amount of this book, but actually we are going back to El Salvador, to Honduras, to Central America in the 80s, the 90s. And if that sounds very kind of dense and complicated, he humanizes the story so beautifully by following very particular and individual cases. So it's one of a few books on the list actually that made me cry, and quite a lot of these books made me cry, and that is testament to the sort of seriousness of the issues and the sensitivity with which they're handled. It's also a very kind of pacey, almost thriller-like book to read. It's a page turner, but the subject matter has got, perhaps amongst the most sort of serious moral depth of all the long list. I really love this book. I've just reread it actually, because we're now at the stage with the long list where we're rereading, and rereading is such a pleasure with books this complicated, because they really do benefit from a second, third reading.
Well, talking of books that make you cry, on to the first of our Rachels. This is Rachel Clark. Pete, The Story of a Heart. Did you find that emotional?
Oh gosh, yes. This one definitely requires tissues. I was in tears at various points throughout it. I should say that I have a confession. I hadn't read any of Rachel Clark's books before, although obviously I know of her through her journalism and her social media presence, but also the fact that her book on the coronavirus got turned into a television show and things like that. So stupidly, I wasn't actually that keen to read this because I'm a simple kind of guy. I'm drawn in this long list. I was drawn to the Annie Jacobsen cover with its big atomic explosion on the front, whereas the kind of figurative art of a cuddle on the front of Rachel Clark's just made me think, oh, this is going to be a sappy book. And gosh, it's emotional. It's really emotional. I should say what it's about, which is it's the story of a heart transplant. And Rachel Clark has managed basically to join the dots between a heart donor, a girl called Kira who died, I think, age 9 in a car accident, and then the heart donee, a boy called Max, who received that heart and survived because of it. And normally you wouldn't be able to join those dots because there's anonymity in all transplants, I think, and families can't meet up. But Max had been the face of a national newspaper campaign, so it meant for various reasons that the families sort of figured out who the other family were and they started talking. And then Rachel Clark stepped in. And this is what really surprised me about this book, because yes, it's very, very emotional, but it's not sappy at all, because what it actually is an unbelievable work of investigative journalism. So Rachel Clark, because she's been able to join these dots, she speaks to everyone. She speaks to the doctors involved, the nurses involved, the first responders, the people who were there at the car crash, and of course, the families themselves. And it's basically a very, very privileged front row seat on a miracle of modern medicine. And the other thing I loved about it as well is it's sort of stealthily, lightly a history book. So Clark is brilliant at little asides that bring in the history of heart transplant, the development of transplants in general, and this sort of the growth of modern medicine through the 20th century. And you just come out of it feeling like you've learned a lot, but you also know these people, and it's just a remarkable book.
On to the second Rachel. This is Rachel Cockrell now. Melting Point, Family, Memory, and the Search for a Promised Land. Chitra, what drew you to this book?
This is such an interesting book. I mean, I think it would probably be our most formally inventive and playful book on the long list. And it actually calls into question the very nature of history itself, because she is telling the story of a family member, her great grandfather. And in so doing, she's sort of touching on the history of Zionism and this astonishing project that I knew nothing about, to send basically, I think it was around 100,000 Jewish people to Texas. Um, and in amongst this, she starts off telling what is ostensibly a family story, a saga, and then she, at some point, decided to completely extricate her own narrative voice from the text. So, what you're left with is this kind of curatorial vision of memoir, newspaper cuttings, reports, basically first-hand accounts of history, and it's all kind of laid out on the page in a very kind of bitty way, and the result of that is this completely immersive historical experience that you are literally with these people. I think we forget, it was Mantell who I remember saying that we forget so much with history that people didn't know what was going to happen next. And this is such a brilliant example of that, that you are drawn into the worlds of these people, many of whom Cockrell has completely rescued from historical obscurity. People like Israel Zangwill, a playwright who was at the forefront really of Zionism, but I think most people would never have heard of him. He actually came up with the phrase melting pot to describe New York in terms of its kind of immigration, and how he felt that, you know, we couldn't possibly send more Jews there because it would explode. There was no room for them, and that's how he ended up coming up with Texas. But in the midst of this, what you get is this very, very relevant story about Israel, about Palestine, about what's happening right now, and sort of reaching back through history to understand why we're at where we are now, which many of the books on our list do. But this is a very potent example. And, you know, one that we actually had to, the judges were sitting in the room going, is this okay? Like, can we do this? Can we longlist an author who has written a book that's not got her own words in it? I mean, it's quite audacious, really. I think it's wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've been doing this alphabetically, but I actually want to mix things up slightly because, Pete, you mentioned the cover of this book. So I'd like you to talk to us about Annie Jacobsen's work, Nuclear War, a Scenario.
Yeah, well, in a weird way, don't believe the cover. So the cover of this book, which, like I say, drew me in because I'm a simple kind of guy, big nuclear explosion, and then it says on the cover in big, bold letters, nuclear war, a scenario. And in a way, that's what it is. Annie Jacobsen presents a case of nuclear war, what would happen, beat by beat, moment by moment. And before I read it, I was excited, but I was excited in the same way that I'd be excited picking up a thriller in an airport, or picking up, you know, a sort of sci-fi book or something. Like I just love that stuff, which may say something bad about me. But I also feared that the book itself might be almost like cheap or gimmicky for similar reasons. Like, you know, like beat by beat nuclear war. Where's this going to take us? And again, I don't want to repeat myself after what I said about Rachel Clark's Story of a Heart, but what really impressed me about this was it's a work of journalism, and again, a work of investigative journalism. So um, Annie Jacobsen has spoken to, well, sort of everyone that she could speak to, I think. There's lots of retired generals. There's lots of people who were directly involved in America's sort of nuclear response agenda. You know, like there's minutes from meetings, there's declassified files. You really feel as though, in a way, that you shouldn't be reading this. Like, why are these things not state secrets? But Annie Jacobsen has sort of wheedled them out and created this just utterly compelling portrait of what would happen and the thinking that has gone into nuclear war. And much of it is just so alarming. I know that's not a surprising thing to say about nuclear war, but you know, there's these moments that just make you stop. I mean, early in the book, there's a businessman who was sat in on some of the early meetings around nuclear war planning, and he stands out of this voice of almost like us, like just terrified at what these sort of generals are talking about around a table. And he compares it to the Wannsee conference, Wannsee conference, where the Nazis decided on their quote unquote final solution when it came to the Jews. And he thought that he was witnessing genocide being written, these decisions about where to bomb and who to bomb and when to bomb them. And these moments in the book are absolutely terrifying. So it's a way more powerful book than I imagined. And I think that power comes from just like the depth of Jacobson's research. She's really gone and sniffed everything out.
Now, Chitra, you were talking about messing with the form and innovative ways of writing with Rachel Cockerell's book. And I guess the same could be said for Richard Flanagan's Question 7.
Absolutely. This is just the most exquisitely wrought um, book. I just hesitated there to even use the word book because it feels like it's something more. It's permeated my being in the way that very few books do. I think Peter Carey said that it was the most significant piece of art to come out of Australia in the last 100 years. And I mean, that says something, doesn't it, about the talent, the enormous kind of humanity of Richard Flanagan, who has won the Booker previously. So he's one of our, up for the double candidates. And this is a book that manages to be about so many different things. It's a meditation on grief, on the death of his parents. It's also about the shadow of the atomic bomb and the Manhattan Project. Flanagan draws this astonishing arc from the the tumultuous affair between H.G. Wells and Rebecca West, to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then to his own father, who was in a prisoner of war camp in Japan. And that's actually how Question 7 opens. Richard Flanagan goes to this part of Japan, and in place of what he thought might be a memorial, there's a love hotel there. And that's how the book opens. And it's also then about the history of Tasmania and genocide there. I mean, this book is about so many things. It reminded me so much of the writing of W.G. Sebald. It's so Sebaldian. And I can think of really no higher compliment for a writer than to be Sebaldian. It's one of the most incredible books I've read in my whole life, never mind this year.
That's high praise. Another one, of course, who's up for the double, Viet Thanh Nguyen, A Man of Two Faces, a memoir, a history, a memorial. Now, listeners will be probably familiar with The Sympathizer, which was his big television series. Pete, what did you make of this book, which I have to say, personally, I absolutely love?
Yeah, I absolutely loved it too. This
Me too. I love it too.
It's the book actually. I find myself smiling now as we talk about it. It makes me smile, and in a way it shouldn't, because it touches on some very dark, disturbing, and very sort of significant themes. So those themes are actually similar to those in The Sympathizer. We're in the territory of the immigrant experience. Viet Thanh Nguyen's family actually fled from Vietnam after the war. I should say fled. They left Vietnam after the war, and they left him behind for a spell. They left an adopted daughter behind. Difficult things happened. They went to America, set up a shop there, and there was a tragedy that happened after there. That in a way, I feel reluctant to spoil for people who haven't read the book. But Nguyen here is grappling with his own past, but that status of being an immigrant, and he tackles this in a way that is much like The Sympathizer. Actually, it doesn't resort to cliche. It pushes back against some ideas. It gives you greater insights to other areas of that experience, and it builds up to a portrait of a family, particularly his parents, but also of a man himself. And the reason I say it makes me smile is, although it's grappling with these big things, it's so funny. It's so light. Like, there are so many places where it just made me laugh. He's just got a kind of natural comic turn, I think. And you can even see this on the page. There's a lot of sort of formal. I mean, we keep saying this with a lot of these books, but there's a lot of sort of experimentalism going on, and you see passages that are right justified on the page rather than left justified. That there's big text, there's little text, there's cut out bits. It all looks a bit crazy, and that might sound off-puttingly experimental to some people, but it's really not. It's just a joy. It's like almost reading a comic book or something. It's just fun. He's having fun with his own story and the story in a way of like huge swathes of America. Yeah, it's it's a really intelligent, deep, and interesting book that just makes me smile.
That's such a brilliant thing to say about it because it's so funny, isn't it? I didn't expect it to be so funny. It's deeply American in terms of its kind of cultural references and its cultural sort of hinterland. But it's also, yeah, really formally daring and interesting. And there were sentences as a sort of a second generation daughter of immigrants myself, like there were sentences that I read in that book that, I actually did a short inhalation of breath. I was just like, he has nailed it.
Exactly. I mean, for instance, when he talks about being Vietnamese American, he's questioning, am I the victim or am I the perpetrator? I thought,
That's right. To have those warring aspects, residing in you. He's so brilliant on that, isn't he?
I just have to say on it being so American, I met him at a literary festival in Washington, and we ended up having a drink in a bar in the very booth in which JFK proposed to Jackie.
That's brilliant.
Let's go on to Wild Thing now. Pete, tell us about Sue Prideaux and her Life of Paul Gauguin.
Yeah, I don't want to. I have this theory with biographers, and I'm sure some biographers have more than one great book in them. And Sue Prideaux has written many good books. Like I loved her biography of Nietzsche that came out a few years ago. But my theory is that biographers have one really great subject in them, the one that they connect with the most, the person they reveal the most about. And I have a feeling that this Life of Paul Gauguin is Sue Prideaux's masterpiece. It's just a tremendous work of biography. So she's very fortunate in a way that she has a subject as interesting as Paul Gauguin, the sort of late 19th century artist. Gauguin led this crazy life. It starts off the book starts off with his youth in Peru and his very sort of dislocated existence, and then you have him befriending artists in France, and he goes to the South Pacific. He makes a couple of trips there. There's illness, there's ill-advised sort of romances, there's things that
he even works on the Panama Canal at one point, doesn't he?
Exactly. Like this is a mad life. And Gauguin, I think, lent into that madness. He's also, I mean, it should be said, he's also a great artist, so that he is worth engaging with. But I think what Prideaux does well is she tells this narrative, and it's utterly compelling. Like this, as artistic biographies go, this is a total page turner. It reads like a kind of soap opera in the best possible way. But I think what Prideaux really does very well is resituate Gauguin, because he's someone now that. Yeah, I don't think we've cancelled him because it's too long ago, really. But we'd certainly consider it nowadays, because on his jaunts to Tahiti, he shacked up basically with very, very young girls. He married someone who I think was sort of 14 at the time, certainly teenage. These are things that we look askance on, and we should look askance on. But there's become this narrative that he was a colonizer. He represented this kind of colonial spirit when in his art and through his actions. And actually, what Prideaux does, she doesn't say no, he wasn't that, but she complicates the story. And the way she complicates the story is she's got access to new material, and new material that includes sort of Gauguin's own diaries from the time, various letters. There's a lot that she has unearthed that comes through in this book. And I think that's really great, actually, because what the book then becomes about is not just about one artist. It becomes about our kind of preconceptions and our prejudices now, and how we should engage with the past. She does not apologize for Gauguin. She does not forgive Gauguin, but she does make us think, hang on a second, are we right? Can we always be so arrogant in our sort of presuppositions nowadays? Or do we always need to know more? And I think that is a great question for nonfiction to be asking in general. Like, just the search for knowledge. Like we always need to know more. We can't judge. We need the superheroes in this world to kind of guide us to the light, as it were. It's a book that starts off about one man, but becomes so much more.
I completely agree with that. That's such a beautiful précis of this book, which I would say is one of the most beautifully written books, not just on the long list, but on all of the books that we've read as part of judging this prize. She is so good at analyzing paintings, her sort of critical appreciation of art and of Gauguin's art and contextualizing it, but also just valuing it as art is really breathtaking. It's such an exquisitely written book, and yeah, it does do this really beautiful negotiation between holding Gauguin to account, but also understanding him within his times, and as he just comes across as just an astonishing figure. I had kind of written him off in some ways as this kind of, oh God, he's, such a perpetrator of the colonial gaze. And this book really, really forced me to reassess my views.
Let's move on now to this book in translation. So I'm talking about David Van Raybroek's book, which is translated by David Colmer and David Mackay. A lot of Davids in that title. It's called Revolutie, Indonesia and the Birth of the Modern World. Pete, what's your take?
I think this is the book. I'm evangelizing for all of these books because they're all brilliant. And I think this is the one where I almost. I'm saying to people, please read this, give it a shot, because I think everything about it screams difficult. Um, the cover isn't. Sorry, there's probably a designer out there listening to this who will now feel very terrible, but the cover isn't the most exciting. It looks just like your standard history book. The title isn't the most exciting. Revolution, like what does that mean? It's thick. It looks daunting. Whereas actually, this is kind of none of those things. Actually, this book is propulsive. It's so well written, and we're saying that about every book on here, but this one I feel is like way better written than it had any right to be. It's poetic as history books go, and it just keeps you reading. But I also think what Van Raybroek really succeeds at is selling the importance of his subject. So here we are, Indonesia, and it feels in a way that we're going to hear a lot more about Indonesia in this century. It's the fourth biggest country in the world. It's kind of situated in a sort of geopolitically important place. It's growing, growing, growing. And yet, how many people can actually point to Indonesia, let alone its capital, Jakarta, on a map, And I think what Van Riebeck is doing here is saying Indonesia's past was important. So he's talking about its path to independence after the Second World War. He goes back centuries and tells the story of Dutch colonialism, before he gets there, and then he talks about the independence movement and how that became influential across the world. So you get this narrative of other independence movements around the world almost copying the Indonesian model. But I think what it's always doing is it's sort of always in conversation with now. And Van Riebeck really captures this sense of why you need to know this history to understand the 21st century. You need to engage with Indonesia. And he's sort of always shuttling back and forward, you feel, between time. I think actually it's very interesting that it starts with him and it starts with a sort of terror attack in Indonesia in the present day, which he could hear from his window. And yeah, this is a history book that engages more with the present than most history books do, and I just think that's really fascinating.
On now to the book, which, as you pointed out, only he could have written. This is Salman Rushdie and Knife, Meditations After an Attempted Murder. Chitra, what spoke to you about this work?
It is such a gripping account of such a deeply traumatic event that, everyone kind of knows about. It was so hugely publicized. It was such a huge thing to happen, and something that, certainly Rushdie had been fearing for rightly for much of his professional life. And what I really, really love, though, about Knife is it is at once a kind of moment to moment description of what exactly happened to him that day at this book festival, where he was attacked on stage. And he runs through that. I think that is actually the best part of this book, when he sort of brings you with that in the way that only Rushdie and the brilliance of that man as a novelist can do. He just drags you into the moment, and you're kind of terrified for him, and you, even though you know how it's going to play out, you feel like you don't know how it's going to play out. Only a great fiction writer can do that, really. But what the book then turns into is this kind of astonishing defense of art. And Rushdie speaks so beautifully, writes so beautifully, rather, about how his knife is in fact his pen. And the very fact that he has arrived at a point in which he is kind of dealing with this, and he has spoken eloquently about how in some ways he had to write this memoir in order to kind of write past it, in order to get back to the desk and write novels again. He had to get this out of the way. So it becomes a kind of defense of literature, of freedom of speech. And by that, I mean the kind of freedom of speech that Rushdie means, as opposed to the sort of weaponization of ideas of freedom that we see so often now, particularly in the United States. So there's something very humanizing and kind of important about this book at the level of being a manifesto for writing itself. So that feels very important to have this book on this long list.
And Pete, your obsession with covers, didn't you love the cover of that?
Oh, it's such an elegant design. Whoever designed that one deserves a pay rise. Just that little cut in the paper, it looks like. But yeah, I mean, just to add to what Chitra said, I love how weird this book is. Actually, it's a really idiosyncratic book. It's not a straightforward telling of the attack, although that's in. There's also like huge paeans of praise, love, I guess, to his wife and her poetry. He has little diversions into pop culture. His reflections on art. It's quite a strange book, but I think that's kind of the point. Is that this is the book that only Salman Rushdie could write, and that's because he survived, and that's because he has his art. He's literally survived to tell the tale in exactly the way he wants to, and I just find that kind of inspirational. Really, it's a good sort of moral model for all artists everywhere, I think.
Yes. Chitra, let's look now at Helen Scales and what the wild sea can be, the future of the world's ocean.
I love this book. It's so, earlier, right at the start of this conversation, we were talking about, the initial meeting of being in the room with all of these, 200, 300 plus books. And one of the emerging themes that I forgot to mention then was, of course, the climate catastrophe. And there were a number of books in the room. And, as we winnowed down and got closer and closer to the long list, some of those books kind of disappeared. But the one that kept returning and kept, forcing itself into the room was Helen Scales's book. And I think that's because she takes a subject that is kind of as huge and shifting and complex and kind of interconnected as our oceans, and just delivers it back to the reader in really accessible and hopeful and evocative and knowledgeable prose. I learned so much from reading this book. This was actually another of the books on the long list that really made me cry. And if fellow readers have kind of sensitivities around orcas, I would definitely call out a trigger warning, because there's a really moving passage about orcas. But yeah, it's a book that kind of goes back into deep time. It's got some beautiful chapters at the beginning about how we are all fundamentally ocean people, even if we have never seen the sea in our lives. That's where we come from. And she talks, she goes back into millennia to talk about just the complexity of our oceans. And I thought this book was particularly good on how delicate these systems are under the surface of the water, how interconnected everything is, and therefore it is also, of course, a clarion call, to take better care of our oceans, what needs to be done. So it's a very sober and kind of critical book, but it is also filled with hope and possibility.
Hmm.
And I think we need that now with the climate conversation, don't we? We do not have the luxury to be apathetic. We need to know what's going on, and then we need to continue to want to do something about it.
Absolutely. And of course, last year's winner was a climate book, Fireweather by John Valiance.
That's right. That's right. Which I have to say I haven't read, but I've heard is absolutely magnificent. So it's no surprise that there was a slew of climate books, on both on the list and published in general, and I think we will continue to see that for years to come.
Oh.
Autism was another thread that ran through. There were quite a lot of books about autism, which is very interesting.
Onto our very last list of the long list, and this is the book by Adam Schatz, The Rebels Clinic: The Revolutionary Lives of Frantz Fanon. Pete.
I think Frantz Fanon continues to be a fascinating figure, in a way because he's multifaceted. So, obviously we know him as this sort of revolutionary leader and speaker in Africa in the 20th century, a post-colonial figure, a fighter for freedom. But he's also quite a significant literary figure, through his books. He was also a medical practitioner. He obviously, as all of these things are suggesting, he led an interesting life. And I think that's made him a very attractive subject for biographers, because you can capture a moment in history, but you can also speak to it through the very captivating figure of Frantz Fanon. So there have been quite a lot of books about him. I think what makes Schatz's different is I almost feel that Adam Schatz is almost uniquely equipped to engage with every single layer of Fanon's life. So Schatz gets the politics. He's a prominent political writer for the London Review of Books himself. So he sort of understands the political currents. He understands Algeria. He's written in the past quite a lot about Algeria, which is where a lot of Fanon's revolutionary activity occurred. He understands the literary aspect. I already mentioned the LRB. Schatz is a writer who gets the writing, and what it all adds up to, I think, is this kind of, you hesitate to call a biography definitive because who knows what will come in future. But so far, I think of all the many biographies of Frantz Fanon, this is the definitive one because it engages with all of those layers. And of course, it's beautifully written. It's very deeply researched. It just feels like the book that Adam Schatz had to write. And I would also say it pairs very well with Revolution, because here we are again in those post-Second World War years of change, of those post-colonial years where countries were figuring themselves out, and characters like Fanon were doing a lot of that figuring out for those countries. So again, another one of our leitmotifs or motifs poking through the surface. I love this.
Now, of course, the two of you, plus your fellow judges, have to go away and read all of that long list again and again to get down to your shortlist.
I know. I'm rereading at the moment Judgment at Tokyo, and it's a book so enormous that literally wherever you go with it, people start talking to you about it. And particularly I think with books like Judgment at Tokyo or Revolution, or the Jonathan Blitzer is another good example. They really do benefit from a second and third reading. And I think the reason for that is partly because of their enormous lengths, but also because they are so deeply researched. The kind of cast of characters that Revolution, for example, Van Raybroek has interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people who in Indonesia who are towards the ends of their lives and who were involved in the revolution. So the work here is so important. So to reread feels both like a privilege, but also a necessity, because these are complicated books. Judgment at Tokyo has got such an amazing cast of characters, and actually Gary J. Bass is so brilliant at that kind of courtroom sketch. the kind of blundering alcoholic judges, and what everyone's eating, and who's got syphilis, and whose nose goes purple when they're shouting at another judge. He's really brilliant on all of that detail, and you only pick up on these sorts of things on second readings.
Well, I would urge everybody to read that list. Sorry, what were you saying, Pete?
I was just saying that this process of re-engaging with the books is a total joy, and I think, as Chitra suggests, it's because we can now luxuriate in them. Obviously, when early on in the process, there's lots and lots and lots of books to read, and some of them are very big, and you sort of have to race through them as best you can. Whereas now, engaging with Judgment at Tokyo with a sort of metaphorical glass of wine in your hand and sitting back and taking it in is just the process just gets better and better and more enjoyable as it goes along, I think.
Well, good luck.
Yeah, and you really, sorry, we keep, this is how enthusiastic Pete and I, we keep interrupting to say something else. But I think that it's a chance to really, really enjoy the prose. Because when you're reading early on in the judging prize, you have to race through the books. So you kind of read the opening chapters and go, yes, this is really brilliantly written. Yes, we'll push this one through. And now you can for a book, say like Question 7, which actually isn't very long at all, you can take your time and really understand the mastery of a writer like Flanagan, who is pulling together all these seemingly disparate threads and making a kind of, the most astoundingly stunning tapestry out of it.
Well, good luck to you both, and many, many thanks. And we'd also like to thank the Blavatnik Family Foundation for its continued generous support of this podcast. Now, the announcement of the 6 books shortlisted for this year's prize will take place on Thursday, the 10th of October, in a live event at Cheltenham Literature Festival. The winner will be announced on Tuesday, the 19th of November. That's at an award ceremony generously once again supported by the Blavatnik Family Foundation. The announcement will also be live streamed across the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction social channels. And if you're interested in finding out more about the long-listed books, you can visit our website or follow us on X, Facebook, Instagram and TikTok at BG Prize. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening. Until next time. Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize podcast. This podcast is generously sponsored by the Blavatnik Family Foundation.